Hi and welcome. My name is Mandana Boss and I work as a tax advisor at Skeppsbron Skatt with corporate taxes.
And my name is Milea Grahn and I work with questions related to VAT and other indirect taxes at Skeppsbron Skatt.
If you are a foreign citizen and want to start your own business in Sweden, the information we will be going through today will be of interest to you. Sweden is a prosperous country with well-performing economy, robust banking system and strong public finances, which makes Sweden one of the best countries for business.
Along with a long-term focus on education and research, a tradition of creativity and innovation, as well as extensive welfare benefits, Sweden offers a safe and thriving environment to run a business. However, it can be difficult to navigate through all the applicable rules and obligations regarding tax and VAT, and that is why we are here to assist you.
If you own a non-Swedish company and wish to run business activities in Sweden, you will have the following options. You can either acquire a Swedish legal entity, such as a limited company, or you can establish a non-Swedish company here by operating it from a permanent establishment in Sweden. And finally, you can operate in Sweden without having a permanent establishment here. Today we are focusing on permanent establishments, as our experience shows that this tends to be an area where many tax issues arise.
Thank you, Mandana. So what is a permanent establishment from a corporate income tax perspective?
The definition of a permanent establishment is specified in the Swedish Income Tax Act. There are general rules and rules that apply to non-Swedish companies with a dependent agent in Sweden. If we start with the general rules, a permanent establishment is a permanent location for business activities, and from this location, the business is entirely or partly run. So 3 conditions must be met. There must be a fixed place of business, the place of business must have a certain degree of permanence, and finally, the business must be entirely or partly run from this location.
So what is a fixed place of business?
A fixed place of business could be a home office, a management office, or a workplace on another company's premises, or for example, a factory.
And when is a place of business considered permanent?
Well, a place of business is normally considered permanent if it has been in operation for 6 months or more. However, even if the activities are run for less than 6 months per year, a location can still be regarded as a fixed place of business if a company's business activities return there annually. Also, it is the company's business concept and core activities that must be carried out entirely or in part from the company's place of business. If the activities carried out in Sweden are purely preparatory or auxiliary, the place of business is not regarded as a permanent establishment. For example, this is the case if the company's accounting or payroll management function is located in Sweden.
Mandana, you mentioned that a non-Swedish company can have a permanent establishment through a dependent agent. Can you please explain this a bit more?
Yes, a permanent establishment may exist if the company has a representative in Sweden who regularly uses a power of attorney to conclude agreements on the company's behalf. This representative is known as a dependent agent. A power of attorney doesn't need to be formalized. However, these agreements must relate to the company's core business.
So what does it mean to have a permanent establishment in Sweden?
Having a permanent establishment in Sweden has implications for a company's taxation, employees and bookkeeping obligations. For example, a non-Swedish company with a permanent establishment in Sweden is taxed on income from the permanent establishment and must pay income tax in Sweden. The company must then file an income tax return. In some cases, a double taxation situation may arise, since the same income may be taxed in Sweden and in the state of residence of the company. This double taxation can usually be eliminated, and this is something we can help you with. Also, a non-Swedish company with a permanent establishment in Sweden must pay special payroll tax on pension contributions for employees and deduct tax from employees' compensation for work in Sweden and register for F-tax. Please be aware that a registration for F-tax is also necessary for a non-Swedish company without a permanent establishment here. If a non-Swedish enterprise without a permanent establishment in Sweden intends to invoice other enterprises for work carried out in Sweden, a F-tax registration is necessary. Otherwise, the payer of the invoice must deduct a preliminary tax of 30% from the payment. A foreign company with a permanent establishment that meets the criteria for being a branch is obliged to keep accounts for its activities in Sweden. If it doesn't meet the criteria for being a branch, you must comply with a general documentation obligation.
Thank you, Mandana. From the 1st of January 2021, certain non-Swedish enterprises without a permanent establishment in Sweden are obliged to submit specific information to the Swedish Tax Agency. Can you please elaborate on this?
Yes, of course. If you don't have a permanent establishment, you are required to submit specific information to the Swedish Tax Agency. The information must be submitted on an annual basis from 2022, and the submission deadline is the same as for income tax returns. The Swedish Tax Agency needs the information so that they can assess whether you have a permanent establishment and whether it is obliged to file income tax returns in Sweden. Only those with limited tax liability in Sweden are required to provide this information. So, Milea, could you please explain what a fixed establishment is from a VAT perspective?
Yes, of course. First of all, it is to be noted that the assessment from a VAT perspective is different from a corporate income tax perspective, and therefore it is important to consider this when deciding whether there is a fixed establishment here. A fixed establishment from a VAT perspective is an establishment that is sufficiently permanent with regards to necessary resources. This means that you need to have personnel here as well as have technical resources in terms of premises or equipment, such as machines. The establishment must also be independent enough to be able to supply goods or services or purchase goods or services. If you trade with goods and have a warehouse here in Sweden on a permanent address where your goods are stored, you could be deemed to have a fixed establishment from a VAT perspective. Another example of a fixed establishment could be if you have personnel here in Sweden that concludes business agreements on behalf of your company.
What are the implications if you are deemed to have a fixed establishment here?
You need to assess whether the fixed establishment has acted as the actual supplier and intervened in the supplies that have been provided. If this is the case, and the supplies are to be tied to the fixed establishment in Sweden and not to the main foreign establishment, the Swedish fixed establishment could be liable to report and pay output VAT on the supplies, meaning the establishment could be obliged to register for VAT in Sweden.
Are there any other situations when a foreign company is obliged to register for VAT purposes in Sweden?
Yes. If you purchase goods that are transported into Sweden from another EU country, reverse charge normally applies, and you as the customer are therefore obliged to report and pay the output VAT in Sweden. This means that you need to register for VAT here. You could be entitled to deduct the corresponding input VAT if the conditions are fulfilled for this. You may need to register for VAT in Sweden if you import goods from another country outside of the EU into Sweden as well. If you as a foreign company sell goods that are located here in Sweden and thereafter transported from Sweden to other countries, it is very likely that you need to register for VAT in Sweden in this situation too. Although Swedish VAT is normally not due on intra-EU sales of goods and export of goods, you need to report the sale in a Swedish VAT return. Intra-EU sales also needs to be reported in an EU sales list. This in order for the tax authorities to be able to follow the transaction and the flow of goods. In this context, both when it comes to intra-EU sales and exports, it should be noted that it is highly important that it can be proven with sufficient transport documentation that the goods in fact have been transported out of Sweden. Otherwise, there is a risk that you need to charge Swedish VAT on the sales.
What about if you sell goods locally within Sweden?
If you as a foreign company sell goods locally within Sweden to customers that are VAT registered here and you're not established here, the rules on local reverse charge could be applicable. This means that you're not required to register for VAT purposes in Sweden and that your customer reports and pays the output VAT instead. Local reverse charge could also be applicable if you as a foreign company provide services related to immovable property to customers registered for VAT in Sweden. Also, if you sell goods or services locally in Sweden to customers that are not registered for VAT, for example, private individuals, you are obliged to register for VAT and report and pay Swedish VAT on those sales.
Thank you. Is there any other situation when reverse charge applies?
Yes, absolutely. The rules on reverse charge for construction services are mandatory when construction services are sold to a construction company. This implies that if you sell construction services to a construction company, the sale would be subject to reverse charge, meaning your customer would be obliged to report and pay the output VAT. This also means that if you provide construction services in Sweden for a building project and you hire local subcontractors for a building project, reverse charge on construction services applies. Consequently, you as the purchaser need to be VAT registered in Sweden in order to report and pay the output VAT. Normally, you're entitled to deduct the corresponding input VAT amount in your VAT return as well. Moreover, if you provide other locally supplied services, you're normally required to report and pay Swedish VAT on those, which means you should be VAT registered here.
Now you have explained a few situations in which a foreign company could be obliged to register for VAT in Sweden, Milea. So how does the VAT registration process work?
If you need to register for VAT in Sweden, an application needs to be submitted to the Swedish tax agency, in which your business activities are described along with other requested information. Depending on the size of your turnover, you can report the VAT on a yearly, quarterly, or monthly basis. If your company is established outside of the EU, you will also need a fiscal representative. There is a lot to consider when doing business in Sweden, and it is good to know that the Swedish tax agency might do audits or might investigate your VAT and tax reporting. Therefore, it is important that you are compliant with the current rules in order to avoid expenses, such as fees for late submissions, tax surcharges, and cost interests.
Thank you, Milea. If you need assistance with registrations, compliance, or if you need VAT and tax advice, let us know. If you're interested to know more, please contact us for a meeting.
Thank you for listening and best of luck with your business in Sweden. We hope to see you soon.